In 1883, in the small village of Collodi, nestled between the rolling hills of Tuscany, something deeply unsettling began to unfold around the publication of a children's story that would later become known worldwide. What most people don't know is that the original manuscript contained elements so disturbing that they were systematically removed before publication, and the man behind this sanitization process disappeared under mysterious circumstances just months after the book's release. The official records from the parish of San Miniato show that Carlo Lorenzini, who wrote under the pseudonym Carlo Collodi, lived as a recluse in the final months of 1883. Neighbors reported strange sounds coming from his modest stone house on Via dei Mulini, sounds they described as the scratching of wood against wood, like furniture being carved in the dead of night. What they didn't know was that Lorenzini had become obsessed with something far more sinister than a simple children's tale. According to a letter discovered in 1958 during the renovation of the old Collodi residence, the author had been receiving visits from a man named Giuseppe Benedetto Cotugno, a wood craftsman from the nearby village of Pescia. Cotugno was 42 years old, a widower who lived alone after losing his wife and infant son to scarlet fever 2 years prior. The letter, written in Lorenzini's increasingly erratic handwriting, mentions that Cotugno had brought him the original puppet and claimed it held secrets that should never see daylight. The relationship between Lorenzini and Cotugno began innocuously enough. Parish records indicate that Cotugno had approached the writer in early 1883, claiming to possess a wooden puppet carved by his recently deceased father, Francesco Cotugno, who had been known throughout the region as a master woodworker. The elder Cotugno had died under strange circumstances in his workshop, found by neighbors after 3 days of absence, surrounded by wood shavings and what appeared to be dozens of unfinished puppet heads, all carved with expressions of terror. Giuseppe told Lorenzini that his father had left behind detailed journals describing the creation of a particular puppet, one that Francesco claimed moved of its own accord and whispered secrets in the darkness. The journals, written in a mixture of Italian and what appeared to be Latin phrases, detailed a woodworking process that involved techniques Francesco claimed to have learned from an old Bohemian craftsman who had passed through Pescia decades earlier. What made the journals particularly disturbing was Francesco's insistence that the puppet required a piece of the creator's soul to achieve true life. The final entries, dated just days before his death, became increasingly illegible, filled with references to the child who never was and the price of breathing life into dead wood. Francesco wrote of hearing the puppet calling to him in the voice of his grandson, a child who had died in infancy years before Giuseppe's birth. Lorenzini became fascinated by these accounts, according to his correspondence with his publisher Felice Paggi. In letters dated throughout the summer of 1883, Lorenzini mentions his desire to create a story that captures the true nature of creation and the terrible responsibility it entails. He wrote of spending hours examining Giuseppe's father's puppet, noting its unusual weight and the way its wooden joints seemed to move, even when no one was touching it. The puppet itself was described in disturbing detail in Lorenzini's personal notes. Unlike the cheerful character that would eventually appear in the published story, this original puppet had been carved from wood taken from a tree that had grown in the cemetery of San Michele, where stillborn children had been buried for generations. The wood was darker than usual pine, almost black in certain lighting, and Francesco had used techniques that left the puppet's face frozen in an expression that witnesses described as neither smile nor frown, but something that suggested terrible knowledge. Giuseppe Cotugno's visits to Lorenzini's house became more frequent throughout the summer months. According to testimony from Maria Benedetta Vanni, an elderly neighbor who lived across the narrow cobblestone street, the two men would spend entire nights in Lorenzini's study, and she could hear them talking in hushed tones that occasionally rose to what sounded like arguments. She reported seeing Giuseppe leave the house on several occasions, carrying bundles wrapped in dark cloth, always before dawn. The transformation in Lorenzini's writing became apparent to those close to him. Enrico Mazzanti, the illustrator who would later create the first images of Pinocchio, visited the author in late August and noted in his diary that Lorenzini seemed consumed by something dark. Mazzanti wrote that the author had lost significant weight, his hands trembled when he wrote, and he spoke constantly of the responsibility of bringing something into existence that should remain in the realm of wood and silence. What Mazzanti found most disturbing was Lorenzini's insistence that the puppet story he was writing was not fiction, but a warning disguised as entertainment. Utim. The author claimed that Francesco Cotugno's journals contained evidence of other craftsmen who had attempted similar creations throughout history, and that all of them had met unfortunate ends. Lorenzini had become convinced that the act of creating life from inanimate materials violated fundamental laws of nature and carried consequences that extended beyond the creator to the community around them. The original manuscript, portions of which were found in 1962 in a trunk left in the basement of the Paggi publishing house in Florence, contained scenes that were far darker than anything that appeared in the final published version. The puppet was not a mischievous child learning moral lessons, but a creature driven by an insatiable hunger to become fully human, willing to cause suffering to others to achieve this transformation. In the original version, the puppet's lies did not simply cause his nose to grow, but resulted in physical pain for those around him. When he lied to the blue fairy, she aged rapidly before his eyes. When he deceived Geppetto, the old man's health deteriorated noticeably. The puppet seemed to draw life force from those who cared for him, becoming more human-like, while they became weak and hollow. The most disturbing element of the original manuscript involved the puppet's relationship with other children. In scenes that were completely removed from the published version, the puppet encountered several children who had run away from home or been abandoned by their families. The puppet would befriend these children, promising to help them find new families or teaching them how to survive on their own. However, each of these encounters ended with the children disappearing, and the puppet becoming slightly more lifelike after each disappearance. Giuseppe Cotugno's own fate became intertwined with the story in ways that only became clear years later. In September of 1883, just as Lorenzini was preparing to submit his final manuscript to Paggi, Giuseppe stopped visiting. Maria Benedetta Vanni reported that she had not seen him for several days, which was unusual given his regular presence at the author's house. When Lorenzini inquired in Pescia about Giuseppe's whereabouts, he discovered that the craftsman had not been seen in his own village either. His small workshop, located behind his deceased father's house, was found locked from the inside, with no sign of forced entry. When local authorities finally broke down the door, they found the workshop in disarray, with wood shavings scattered across the floor and what appeared to be the remains of several puppet pieces, all carved with expressions of anguish. Most disturbing was the discovery of Giuseppe's personal effects, arranged on his workbench, in a pattern that suggested ritual significance. His father's carving tools had been arranged in a perfect circle around a piece of dark wood that had been carved into the rough shape of a human heart. Next to this arrangement was a note written in Giuseppe's hand that simply read, "The debt has been paid, but the hunger remains." The puppet that Giuseppe had brought to Lorenzini was nowhere to be found in the workshop. A thorough search of Giuseppe's house and the surrounding area yielded no trace of either the craftsman or the wooden figure that had inspired the story. It was as if both had simply vanished from existence, leaving behind only scattered wood shavings and the lingering scent of pine resin. Lorenzini's reaction to Giuseppe's disappearance marked the beginning of his own decline. According to his housekeeper Caterina Bindi, the author became increasingly paranoid, claiming that he could hear wooden footsteps in his house at night and that his writing instruments were being moved when he wasn't looking. He began sleeping during the day and working only at night, barricading himself in his study with furniture piled against the door. The manuscript that Lorenzini finally submitted to Felice Paggi in October of 1883 was vastly different from his original draft. Gone were the disturbing scenes of the puppet's predatory behavior and the explicit connections to Francesco Cotugno's dark experiments. What remained was a sanitized version that focused on moral lessons and childhood misbehavior, though even this version contained elements that made Paggi uncomfortable. Paggi's own letters to his business partner, Gaetano Polidori, revealed the publisher's concerns about certain aspects of the story. He wrote that while the tale had commercial potential, there were undertones that suggested knowledge of things that should remain hidden. Paggi was particularly disturbed by Lorenzini's insistence that certain scenes be included exactly as written, claiming that any changes would break the containment of something dangerous. The editing process became a source of conflict between author and publisher. Lorenzini argued fiercely against removing specific details, such as the description of Geppetto's workshop being filled with the whispers of all the wood that had once been living trees, and references to the puppet's ability to hear the memories contained within his wooden body. These elements were ultimately removed, but not before causing significant tension between the two men. What made the situation more disturbing was Lorenzini's claim that he was not actually the author of the story, but merely its transcriber. He insisted that the tale had been dictated to him by forces he could not fully understand, and that his role was simply to serve as a conduit for something that needed to be told. This claim became more frequent and more insistent as the publication date approached. The first signs that something was seriously wrong with Lorenzini appeared in November of 1883, just as the initial chapters of the story were being published in the children's newspaper Giornale per I Bambini. Caterina Bindi reported that she had found him in his study one morning, standing perfectly still in front of his writing desk, staring at a blank piece of paper for what she estimated had been several hours. When she spoke to him, Lorenzini did not respond immediately, and when he finally turned to look at her, his expression was one of complete confusion, as if he did not recognize her despite her having worked in his household for over 3 years. He asked her repeatedly what day it was, and seemed surprised to learn that time had passed since he had last been aware of his surroundings. These episodes of disconnection from reality became more frequent throughout November and December. Lorenzini would often be found standing motionless in various rooms of his house, always facing toward his study, as if listening for something only he could hear. When questioned about these incidents, he would claim that he was waiting for instructions and that the story was not yet complete. The completion of the Pinocchio story coincided with a dramatic deterioration in Lorenzini's mental and physical health. By December of 1883, he had lost considerable weight and developed a persistent tremor in his hands that made writing extremely difficult. His speech became halting and fragmented, and he often spoke as if addressing someone who was not present in the room. Caterina Bindi's final report about her employer, given to local authorities in January of 1884, described finding him in his study on the morning of December 31st, seated at his desk with his head resting on his arms. Initially, she assumed he had fallen asleep while working, but when she approached to wake him, she discovered that he was completely unresponsive. though still breathing. What disturbed her most was the state of his writing desk. Every piece of paper in the study had been covered with the same phrase, written over and over in Lorenzini's increasingly erratic handwriting. "The wood remembers everything." The phrase appeared hundreds of times, covering not just paper, but also carved into the wooden surface of the desk itself, as if written with a sharp instrument that had gouged deep marks into the wood. Lorenzini lingered in this catatonic state for several months, cared for by his housekeeper and visited occasionally by Dr. Alessandro Martini, a physician from the nearby town of Lucca who specialized in disorders of the mind. Dr. Martini's notes, discovered in hospital archives in 1955, describe a patient who seemed aware of his surroundings, but completely unable to communicate in any meaningful way. The doctor noted that Lorenzini would sometimes move his hands as if writing, even when no writing materials were present, and that he seemed to be listening constantly for sounds that others could not hear. Most disturbing was the patient's apparent fear of wooden objects, including the furniture in his own house. Dr. Martini wrote that Lorenzini would become agitated whenever he was near anything made of wood, and that he had to be moved to a room furnished entirely with metal and fabric. The end came in April of 1884. Caterina Bindi found Lorenzini's room empty one morning, with no sign of how he had left or where he had gone. A search of the house and surrounding area revealed no trace of him, though neighbors reported having heard the sound of footsteps on wooden floors throughout the night, despite the fact that Lorenzini's room had no wooden flooring. The search for the missing author was brief and largely ineffective. Local authorities concluded that Lorenzini had wandered away during a period of confusion and had likely died of exposure in the surrounding hills. His body was never found, though several witnesses reported seeing a solitary figure walking through the forests near Collodi in the weeks following his disappearance, always alone. Always moving with a peculiar wooden stiffness that suggested something fundamentally wrong with the way the figure moved. The publication of the complete Pinocchio story continued without its author, guided by Felice Paggi's editorial decisions and the illustrations created by Enrico Mazzanti. The story became an immediate success with children and parents throughout Italy, praised for its moral lessons and charming portrayal of a puppet's journey toward humanity. What readers did not know was that the published version represented only a fraction of Lorenzini's original vision. The missing portions of the manuscript began to surface decades later, discovered in various locations throughout Tuscany under circumstances that suggested they had been deliberately hidden. In 1921, renovation work on an old church in Pescia revealed several pages of handwritten text concealed behind a wooden panel in the confessional. The pages contained scenes from the original Pinocchio story that had never been published, including detailed descriptions of the puppet's encounters with other wooden figures that had been awakened by craftsmen throughout history. These lost pages described a community of animated wooden beings living in the forests around Collodi, creatures that had once been puppets or carved figures, but had achieved a form of life through processes similar to those described in Francesco Cotugno's journals. According to Lorenzini's original text, these creatures survived by drawing life force from living beings, particularly children, whom they could lure away from their families with promises of magical adventures. The puppet that would become known as Pinocchio was presented in these lost pages not as an innocent creation seeking to become a real boy, but as a predator specifically designed to infiltrate human families and harvest the life force needed to sustain the larger community of wooden beings. The lies that caused his nose to grow were not moral failings, but a biological necessity, as deception was the mechanism by which he could form the emotional connections necessary to drain his victim's vitality. More disturbing revelations emerged in 1934. When workers, demolishing an abandoned house near the original Collodi residence, discovered a hidden room that had been sealed behind a brick wall. The room contained what appeared to be a workshop filled with wooden figures in various stages of completion, all carved with expressions of suffering or terror. Among these figures was a puppet that matched the descriptions from Francesco Cotugno's journals, sitting on a workbench surrounded by carving tools and sheets of paper covered with text in multiple languages. The puppet found in this sealed room was examined by experts from the University of Florence, who noted several unusual characteristics that defied conventional understanding of woodworking techniques. The figure appeared to have been carved from a single piece of wood, despite its complex articulation and detailed features, and showed no signs of the tool marks that would typically be visible on a carved surface. Most disturbing was the puppet's weight, which was significantly heavier than solid wood of similar size should have been. Analysis of the wood itself revealed properties that puzzled the examining scientists. While it appeared to be pine, carbon dating suggested an age that was inconsistent with the known history of the region, and microscopic examination revealed cellular structures that did not match any known species of tree. The puppet seemed to be made of wood that had never existed in nature, or that had been altered by processes unknown to conventional forestry. The papers found alongside the puppet included fragments of text in Francesco Cotugno's handwriting, but also pages written in scripts that experts could not identify. Some appeared to be Latin, others resembled Germanic languages, and still others seemed to use symbols that had no correlation to any known writing system. The few passages that could be translated referred to techniques for transferring consciousness between vessels and binding soul to substance. Perhaps most unsettling was the discovery of a journal entry dated just days before Francesco Cotugno's death, in which he described successfully completing his life's work, but expressed terror at what he had accomplished. He wrote of the puppet displaying signs of independent thought and movement, and of its apparent ability to influence the behavior of other wooden objects in his workshop. Francesco claimed that the puppet had begun communicating with him, not through speech, but through manipulation of the workshop environment, arranging tools and materials in patterns that conveyed complex messages. The final entry in Francesco's journal described his growing realization that he had not created life, but had instead provided a vessel for something that had been waiting for the opportunity to enter the physical world. He wrote of the puppet's claims to be far older than its wooden body, speaking of memories that spanned centuries and knowledge of other craftsmen who had unknowingly served as its creators throughout history. This revelation cast new light on the disappearances that had occurred around Collodi in the years following the puppet's creation. Local records showed that several children had gone missing from the surrounding villages between 1880 and 1883, all under circumstances that left no trace of their fate. The children were described as having been lured away from their homes by promises of adventure or by strangers who claimed to need their help with simple tasks. What connected these disappearances was the testimony of witnesses who reported seeing the missing children in the company of a figure that moved with an unusual, jerky gait characteristic of a marionette. These sightings always occurred near wooded areas, and the figure was consistently described as being accompanied by the sound of creaking wood, even when no wind was present to cause such sounds. The investigation into these historical disappearances was reopened in 1938 by Inspector Maurizio Benedetti of the provincial police, who had become interested in the case after reading about the discovery of the sealed workshop. Inspector Benedetti's files, found in police archives in 1959, reveal a systematic pattern of child disappearances throughout Tuscany that had been occurring for decades, all sharing similar characteristics and all connected to reports of strange wooden figures in the vicinity. Inspector Benedetti's investigation uncovered evidence of a network of craftsmen throughout northern Italy who had been creating animated wooden figures using techniques similar to those described in Francesco Cotugno's journals. These craftsmen appeared to have been in communication with each other, sharing methods and materials through a system of coded correspondence that used woodworking terminology to disguise discussions of their actual activities. The investigation was abruptly terminated in 1939 when Inspector Benedetti himself disappeared while investigating a workshop in the mountains near Modena. His abandoned automobile was found on a remote forest road, with all of his investigative files missing and no sign of struggle or foul play. Witnesses in the area reported hearing the sound of wooden footsteps in the forest for several nights following his disappearance, always moving in formation as if multiple figures were walking together through the trees. The connection between these events and the original Pinocchio story became clear only when researchers began examining the complete history of Carlo Lorenzini's life and work. Investigation into his family background revealed that his maternal grandfather had been a woodworker who had died under mysterious circumstances in 1832, found in his workshop, surrounded by carved figures that neighbors claimed had not been there the previous day. This discovery led to the examination of older records, reaching back into the 18th century, which revealed a pattern of similar incidents throughout the region. Craftsmen specializing in detailed wooden figures would periodically be found dead in their workshops, always surrounded by their creations and always leaving behind evidence of having been engaged in experiments that went far beyond conventional woodworking. The pattern suggested that the knowledge needed to create animated wooden beings had been passed down through generations, possibly for centuries, with each craftsman adding to the accumulated understanding until someone like Francesco Cotugno could achieve the level of success that resulted in a truly autonomous wooden creature. The puppet that inspired Lorenzini's story was not an isolated creation, but the culmination of generations of experimentation and refinement. What made this revelation particularly disturbing was the implication that the published Pinocchio story served not as fiction, but as a coded warning about the dangers of these experiments. By disguising the true nature of animated wooden beings as a harmless children's tale, Lorenzini had found a way to preserve knowledge of their existence while preventing others from recognizing the real threat they represented. The sanitized version of the story that reached the public contained enough truth to serve as a record for those who knew how to interpret its hidden meanings, while appearing innocent enough to avoid attracting the attention of authorities who might have investigated more deeply. The moral lessons about honesty and obedience took on new significance when understood as instructions for recognizing and avoiding the manipulative tactics used by wooden creatures to gain the trust of their intended victims. Analysis of subsequent versions of the Pinocchio story, including the famous Disney adaptation, revealed a systematic pattern of further sanitization, with each retelling removing more of the elements that could serve as warnings about the true nature of animated wooden beings. The progression from Lorenzini's original dark tale to the cheerful modern versions represented a gradual erosion of humanity's collective memory of a very real threat. The final piece of this disturbing puzzle emerged in 1947, when Allied forces investigating Nazi occult activities discovered a cache of documents in a castle near Munich that included correspondence between German researchers and craftsmen throughout Europe. Among these papers were detailed diagrams showing techniques for creating animated wooden figures, along with reports of successful experiments conducted throughout the 1930s. The German research appeared to have been based on information gathered from the same sources that had inspired Francesco Cotugno's work, suggesting that the knowledge of wooden animation had spread far beyond the hills of Tuscany. The documents included references to plans for creating entire armies of wooden soldiers that could operate independently of human command, and mentioned successful tests conducted using techniques derived from the Italian prototype. Most disturbing was a report dated 1943 describing the discovery of a wooden figure in a bombed building in Florence that had survived the destruction while everything around it was reduced to rubble. The figure was described as being identical to illustrations from the Pinocchio story, and witnesses claimed it had been seen moving through the wreckage on its own, apparently searching for something among the destroyed buildings. This figure was transported to Germany for further study, but the convoy carrying it was attacked by resistance fighters near the Swiss border. When Allied forces examined the wreckage of the convoy years later, they found no trace of the wooden figure, though local residents reported strange incidents in the surrounding forests throughout the remainder of the war, including the disappearance of several German soldiers who had been assigned to search for the missing cargo. The post-war years brought new reports of wooden figures appearing in various locations throughout Europe, always in areas that had been associated with the wartime research into animation techniques. These figures were typically described as being child-sized and moving with the characteristic jerky motion of marionettes, but witnesses consistently noted an intelligence in their movements that suggested something far more sophisticated than simple puppetry. In 1952, a construction crew working on rebuilding efforts in Munich discovered a hidden laboratory beneath the ruins of a bombed university building. The laboratory contained extensive notes on wooden animation research, along with several completed figures that had been abandoned when the building was evacuated during Allied bombing raids. The figures were examined by experts who noted their similarity to descriptions from the Italian cases, suggesting a direct connection between the German research and the original experiments conducted in Tuscany. What made this discovery particularly significant was the presence of a figure that exactly matched contemporary descriptions of the puppet that had inspired Lorenzini's story. This puppet, designated as Subject Alpha in the German research notes, was described as being far more advanced than the other figures, displaying signs of autonomous behavior that suggested genuine consciousness rather than mere animation. The research notes indicated that Subject Alpha had been used as a template for creating other figures, with German scientists attempting to understand and replicate the techniques that had given it its advanced capabilities. The experiments had achieved varying degrees of success, but none of the German-created figures had achieved the level of independence displayed by the original puppet. Subject Alpha itself had apparently been destroyed during the final bombing of Munich, according to the research notes, but eyewitness reports from the construction crew suggested otherwise. Workers claimed to have seen a small figure moving through the rubble of the laboratory, and several reported hearing the sound of wooden footsteps in the building at night long after work hours had ended. The investigation into these reports was handled by British intelligence officers who had been tasked with documenting Nazi occult research activities. Their classified report, declassified in 1968, concluded that Subject Alpha had survived the destruction of the laboratory and had likely escaped the building during the chaos of the city's final capture by Allied forces. Tracking down Subject Alpha became a priority for intelligence services throughout Europe, as the puppet represented both a potential security threat and a source of valuable information about advanced animation techniques that could have military applications. The search was complicated by the puppet's apparent ability to blend in with ordinary wooden objects when motionless, making visual identification extremely difficult. Reports of encounters with wooden figures continued throughout the 1950s and 60s, but the puppets appeared to have learned to avoid human contact, operating primarily at night and in remote areas where they were unlikely to be observed. When encounters did occur, witnesses consistently described creatures that seemed to be studying human behavior, as if gathering intelligence for some unknown purpose. The most detailed account of such an encounter came from Dr. Elena Marchetti, a folklorist from the University of Rome, who had been researching the origins of the Pinocchio story. In 1961, while examining archives in a monastery near Collodi, Dr. Marchetti reported meeting a figure that identified itself as the original puppet that had inspired Lorenzini's tale. According to Dr. Marchetti's account, the puppet appeared in the monastery library while she was working alone late at night, emerging from behind a bookshelf as if it had been waiting for the opportunity to speak with her. The creature spoke in fluent Italian, though with an archaic accent that suggested someone who had learned the language decades earlier and had not adapted to modern usage. The puppet claimed to have been observing Dr. Marchetti's research and expressed appreciation for her efforts to uncover the true story behind Lorenzini's work. It provided detailed information about the circumstances surrounding the original tale's creation, confirming many of the theories that Dr. Marchetti had developed through her archival research. Most significantly, the puppet explained that it had deliberately influenced Lorenzini's writing to ensure that some record of its existence would survive, while carefully controlling the information revealed to prevent humans from learning enough to create additional animated figures. The published story served as both a confession and a warning, allowing the puppet to acknowledge its existence while discouraging others from following Francesco Cotugno's example. The puppet expressed regret for the disappearances of children that had occurred during its early years, claiming that it had not understood the consequences of its need to draw life force from living beings. It stated that it had learned to sustain itself through less harmful means, though it did not elaborate on what these methods involved. Dr. Marchetti's encounter lasted several hours, during which the puppet provided extensive details about its origins and the broader community of animated wooden beings that existed throughout Europe. The creature claimed that most of these beings were far less sophisticated than itself, operating on instinct rather than true consciousness, but that all of them shared the same basic need to draw energy from living sources. The puppet warned Dr. Marchetti that renewed interest in wooden animation techniques could lead to the creation of more creatures like itself, but with none of the restraint that it had learned through decades of experience. It expressed particular concern about the German research it had observed during the war, and about the possibility that similar experiments were being conducted in other countries. When Dr. Marchetti asked about the fate of Carlo Lorenzini, the puppet confirmed that the author had indeed disappeared as a result of his involvement with the story's creation, but claimed that his fate had been more complex than simple death or madness. According to the puppet, Lorenzini had become so deeply connected to the story he was telling that he had been gradually absorbed into it, becoming part of the narrative rather than remaining its external author. This explanation provided a disturbing new perspective on the reports of wooden figures moving through the forests near Collodi in the years following Lorenzini's disappearance. If the puppet's claims were accurate, these sightings may have been of Lorenzini himself, transformed by his deep engagement with forces he had not understood when he began writing his story. Dr. Marchetti's final question concerned the puppet's plans for the future, and its response provided little comfort. The creature stated that it intended to continue existing as long as possible, observing human development and occasionally intervening to prevent the creation of additional animated beings. it suggested that it viewed itself as the guardian of secrets that humanity was not ready to possess, and that it would take whatever actions necessary to maintain this protective role. The encounter ended when the puppet simply walked back behind the bookshelf and disappeared, leaving Dr. Marchetti alone in the library, with only her notes as evidence that the conversation had occurred. Attempts to locate the creature again were unsuccessful, though Dr. Marchetti reported sensing its presence during several subsequent visits to archives and libraries throughout Tuscany. Dr. Marchetti's account was initially met with skepticism by her academic colleagues, but it gained credibility when other researchers began reporting similar encounters with wooden figures in libraries and archives throughout Italy. The pattern suggested that these creatures were actively monitoring human research into their existence and were selectively revealing information to researchers whose work they deemed appropriate. The implications of these encounters extended far beyond the academic study of folklore and historical mysteries. If Dr. Marchetti's account was accurate, it meant that highly intelligent, non-human entities were living alongside human society, possessing knowledge and capabilities that could fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of consciousness, animation, and the nature of life itself. The puppet's warning about the dangers of renewed research into wooden animation proved prophetic when, in 1963, reports began emerging of mysterious deaths among craftsmen and researchers throughout Europe who had been investigating historical accounts of animated wooden figures. These deaths always occurred under circumstances that suggested natural causes, but the pattern of timing and location suggested a more sinister explanation. The deaths were characterized by their apparent randomness and the lack of any clear connecting factor beyond the victim's research interests. A woodworker in Germany who had been attempting to recreate Francesco Cotugno's techniques was found dead in his workshop, apparently of heart failure, surrounded by half-finished puppets that witnesses claimed had not been there the previous day. A historian in France, who had been documenting cases of animated wooden figures, was discovered in his study, having apparently died in his sleep, with all of his research notes missing. The pattern became more apparent when intelligence services began sharing information about these incidents, revealing that similar deaths had been occurring throughout Europe at an accelerating rate. In each case, the victim had been engaged in research or experimentation related to wooden animation techniques, and the circumstances of death effectively prevented their work from being completed or shared with others. What made these incidents particularly disturbing was the apparent precision with which they targeted individuals whose work posed a genuine threat to the secrets surrounding animated wooden beings. Amateur researchers and casual enthusiasts were left unharmed, while serious investigators who seemed close to achieving significant breakthroughs invariably met unfortunate ends before their work could be completed. This selective targeting suggested a level of intelligence gathering and coordination that exceeded the capabilities of any individual animated figure, implying the existence of a network of such creatures working together to protect their secrets. The puppet that had spoken with Dr. Marchetti had mentioned a broader community of animated beings, and these incidents provided evidence that this community was actively engaged in suppressing human research into their existence. The realization that humanity was sharing the world with an unknown number of intelligent wooden beings capable of coordinated action created significant concern among the intelligence services that had been monitoring these developments. The creatures appeared to be technologically primitive, relying on woodworking techniques rather than modern manufacturing methods, but their apparent immortality and immunity to conventional forms of detection made them extremely difficult to track or counter. Attempts to establish formal communication with these beings were unsuccessful, as they seemed to prefer operating from the shadows and revealing themselves only to selected individuals under carefully controlled circumstances. The encounters that did occur, such as Dr. Marchetti's meeting with the original puppet, appeared to be initiated by the creatures themselves, rather than resulting from human efforts to make contact. The mystery of the animated wooden beings entered a new phase in 1968, when previously classified documents related to wartime occult research were released to academic researchers. These documents provided the most comprehensive picture to date of the scope and sophistication of the creatures' activities, revealing that they had been influencing human events for far longer than anyone had suspected. The documents included reports from various European resistance movements describing encounters with wooden figures that had provided assistance in sabotaging German research facilities and transportation networks. These figures had apparently possessed detailed knowledge of German military operations and had been able to move through occupied territory without detection, providing valuable intelligence to Allied forces. What made these reports particularly significant was their suggestion that the animated wooden beings had actively chosen sides in human conflicts, supporting efforts to prevent the German animation research from achieving its goals. This indicated a level of political sophistication that implied the creatures were capable of making complex strategic decisions based on their assessment of long-term threats to their existence. The documents also revealed that similar wooden figures had been observed in other conflict zones throughout the 20th century, always appearing during periods when occult or supernatural research was being conducted by military forces. The pattern suggested that these creatures had been monitoring and intervening in human affairs for decades, possibly centuries, while remaining largely undetected by conventional intelligence services. This new understanding of the animated wooden beings' activities cast the entire history of the Pinocchio story in a different light. Rather than being a simple children's tale that accidentally revealed the existence of unusual creatures, the story appeared to have been part of a deliberate campaign by the creatures themselves to control public perception of their nature and capabilities. By ensuring that knowledge of their existence was preserved in the form of a harmless fairy tale, the creatures had achieved several strategic objectives. They had created a record that could serve as a warning to future generations, while simultaneously making it extremely difficult for anyone to take reports of actual encounters seriously. The association between wooden animation and children's entertainment provided perfect cover for creatures that needed to remain hidden from systematic investigation. The genius of this approach became apparent when researchers began examining public reactions to reports of animated wooden figures throughout the 20th century. Witnesses to such encounters were consistently dismissed as delusional or attention-seeking, precisely because their reports sounded like descriptions of fictional characters from a beloved children's story. The creatures had effectively weaponized humanity's own cultural associations, using the innocent reputation of the Pinocchio story to create a protective barrier around their true activities. This demonstrated a level of psychological sophistication that suggested they had been studying human behavior for far longer than anyone had previously suspected. The final revelation about the true scope of the animated wooden beings' influence came in 1969, when renovations of the Vatican's secret archives uncovered documents dating back to the 16th century that described encounters with wooden figures throughout European history. These documents suggested that the Catholic Church had been aware of the creature's existence for centuries and had developed specific protocols for dealing with them. The Vatican documents included detailed accounts of exorcisms performed on wooden figures that had been brought to church authorities by frightened craftsmen who claimed their creations had become possessed. In most cases, these exorcisms had been unsuccessful, as the animating force within the figures appeared to be fundamentally different from the demonic entities that traditional exorcism techniques were designed to address. More significantly, the documents revealed that high-ranking church officials had eventually concluded that the wooden beings were not demonic in nature, but represented something far more complex and potentially dangerous. The creatures appeared to be entities that had existed independently of human creation, using wooden vessels as temporary hosts while pursuing goals that remained largely incomprehensible to human observers. This interpretation suggested that Francesco Cotugno and other craftsmen had not actually created life from inanimate materials, but had instead provided suitable vessels for pre-existing entities that needed physical forms in order to interact with the material world. The woodworking techniques described in the various journals and research notes may have been methods for creating bodies that these entities could inhabit, rather than processes for generating consciousness from nothing. The implications of this revelation were staggering, as they suggested that humanity had been unknowingly sharing the world with an entirely different form of intelligent life, one that operated according to principles that were fundamentally alien to human understanding. The creature's apparent ability to move between different wooden bodies, their immunity to aging and physical damage, and their collective memory spanning centuries all pointed to a form of existence that had more in common with energy patterns than with biological life. The Vatican documents concluded with a recommendation that the Church maintain a policy of careful observation regarding these entities, neither actively opposing them nor attempting to assist them, but simply documenting their activities for future reference. This policy appeared to have remained in effect for centuries, with church officials quietly monitoring reports of animated wooden figures while avoiding any public acknowledgement of their existence. The discovery of these historical documents provided the final piece needed to understand the true story behind Carlo Lorenzini's tale of Pinocchio. The puppet that had inspired his story was not the creation of Francesco Cotugno, but rather an ancient entity that had chosen to inhabit the wooden vessel that Cotugno had crafted. The craftsman's apparent death had likely occurred when the entity no longer needed his services, leaving behind only the puppet and the terrible knowledge of what he had helped to accomplish. Lorenzini's transformation and eventual disappearance could be understood as the result of his deep contact with an entity that operated according to principles completely outside human experience. His gradual loss of identity and ultimate absorption into the story he was writing represented the price of attempting to document something that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. The sanitized version of the tale that reached the public served the entity's purposes perfectly, preserving essential information about its nature, while ensuring that this information was embedded within a context that would prevent most humans from recognizing its significance. The story functioned as both revelation and concealment, allowing the truth to hide in plain sight. Giuseppe Cotugno's disappearance marked the end of one phase of the entity's existence and the beginning of another. Having achieved a form that could move freely through human society while avoiding detection, the puppet was free to pursue goals that remained unknown to human observers. Its subsequent appearances in libraries and archives suggested an ongoing interest in monitoring human knowledge and ensuring that certain secrets remained protected. The broader community of animated wooden beings represented a network of similar entities, each inhabiting its own carefully crafted vessel and working toward shared objectives that transcended individual human understanding. Their collective activities throughout the centuries suggested a long-term strategy that operated on temporal scales far exceeding human planning horizons. The deaths of researchers who came too close to understanding the truth about wooden animation served as a reminder that these entities possessed both the capability and the willingness to protect their secrets through whatever means necessary. The precision and timing of these interventions demonstrated a level of coordination and intelligence gathering that should have been impossible for creatures operating with pre-industrial technology. The story of Pinocchio, stripped of its sanitized presentation and understood in its proper historical context, revealed itself to be one of the most disturbing accounts of human contact with non-human intelligence ever documented. What generations of children had enjoyed as a harmless tale of moral instruction was actually a carefully constructed warning about entities that continued to exist alongside human civilization, pursuing unknown goals while remaining largely invisible to conventional detection methods. The puppet that had inspired Lorenzini's story remained somewhere in the world, possibly still observing human development and occasionally revealing itself to selected individuals whose work served its purposes. Its claimed role as guardian of dangerous knowledge suggested that humanity's relationship with these entities would continue to be defined by carefully maintained ignorance, with the creatures themselves determining what information could safely be revealed. The true story behind Pinocchio served as a reminder that reality contained layers of complexity and danger that most humans were neither equipped to understand nor prepared to confront. The animated wooden beings represented a form of intelligence that had learned to thrive in the spaces between human awareness, using humanity's own cultural constructs to maintain the secrecy necessary for their continued existence. In the end, Carlo Lorenzini's tale succeeded in its hidden purpose, preserving essential truth within a framework of apparent fiction, while ensuring that this truth remained accessible only to those who possessed the knowledge needed to interpret its real meaning. The puppet's story continued to be told, generation after generation, carrying its warning forward through time, disguised as innocent entertainment. The wooden beings themselves remained active, watching and waiting, intervening when necessary to protect their secrets while pursuing goals that human understanding could not encompass. Their presence served as a constant reminder that the world contained mysteries that exceeded human comprehension, and that some knowledge was perhaps too dangerous for widespread revelation. The story of Pinocchio, understood in its true context, represented both the beginning and the continuation of humanity's relationship with entities that existed beyond the boundaries of normal experience. The puppet's transformation from wooden figure to living being was not a fairy tale ending, but rather the starting point for a much more complex and ongoing interaction between human civilization and intelligences that operated according to entirely different principles. And somewhere in the world, in libraries and archives and quiet workshops, the descendants of Francesco Cotugno's creation continued their work, ensuring that certain secrets remained protected, while humanity continued its oblivious journey through a reality far more complex and dangerous than most people could ever imagine. The true story of Pinocchio was not a tale of childhood wonder, but rather a documented account of humanity's first recorded encounter with entities that had learned to hide their existence within the very stories we told ourselves to make sense of the world. The puppet's nose growing with each lie served as a metaphor for the expanding gap between perceived reality and hidden truth, a gap that these entities had learned to exploit with masterful precision. Time passed, but the wooden hearts continued to beat in silence, waiting for the next chapter of a story that was far from over.